Hello and Assalamu alaikum. I am Parvez Khan. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Journalism and Mass Communication, Kohat University of Science and Technology. The subject is intercultural communication. The course code is GMC 201. It's our lecture number 11, which is low context culture. Before starting our session, we'll be discussing the objectives of this class first. The objective is that students will be able to understand that each culture differs in its orientation, its interactions, and that cultural interactions are based on certain contexts. And it will also help students that they'll be able to understand the dynamics of low context culture. So we start off again with this picture, a similar picture when we were discussing the high context culture, that sometimes you're not aware of the gestures, of the interactions, of the meetings, and you don't know how to respond, particularly if you are interacting with a person outside your own culture, outside your own domain, or outside your own daily interactions. So it's important to understand that cultural differences will always be there, and people interact differently because of their cultural backgrounds, and that the understanding them is the key. This is an important point, that if we are to adjust ourselves as global citizens, if we are to adjust ourselves in a culture other than ourselves, the only way we can do it is by understanding them. And it only happens when you spend more time, when you interact with them, when you go out. That's when it's going to happen. And this is why this subject is so important, because it teaches us, it helps us, it guides us in how to interact with people outside our own culture. So we must understand that an important point is about language, that language reflects our cultural experiences, and that learning a language does not only mean about words, it's not just the words that you're learning, it also means that we need to learn the cultural context that are embedded in the language itself. So language itself is not something hollow, or you cannot memorize it, or you can say that I am an expert of a language if I can just memorize some alphabets. It's not just about alphabets. The context is more important. Even the stories written in other languages, when they're translated, it often loses its meanings. So language itself is important only when you are aware of the cultural context. That's where you are able to understand the deeper meaning, the inside meanings, the hidden meanings in any language. So today we'll be talking about low context culture. Previously we discussed the same topic, which was where we focused on high context culture. This time we are going to focus on low context culture. So as you remember that we previously talked about high context culture, which was where we said that it's implicit, it's indirect, people say things. But low context culture is completely opposite. It relies on explicit communication. It's direct, it's more direct. In low context communication, more of the information in a message is spelled out and defined. It is clearly explained. So cultures with Western European roots, such as United States and Australia, are generally considered to be low context cultures. And low context cultures are those that communicate information in direct, explicit, and precise ways. This is in contrast to high context cultures, which communicate in ways that are implicit and rely heavily on nonverbal language, which means that low context culture is more direct, it's said directly, it's clearly defined, whereas high context culture depends more on the context, more on the language, more on the symbols, more on the gestures, and it's implicit, it's not direct. And what is the role of communication when we talk about communication? Does it change according to the context? What kind of context? What kind of culture there is? Is it a high context culture? Is it a low context culture? So does the form of communication change? So yes, communication in general is different for high and low context cultures. The forms of communication also change, including the types of media that they enjoy. And in today's fast paced digital age, these forms can shift, but the underlying preferences stay the same. So, yes, the types of media also, the forms of media also change when it comes to high context and low context cultures. And generally, high context culture prefer oral communications, whereas the low context culture favor written communication. So that's a big difference. We've already spoken about it, but this is what the high context culture prefers oral communication, while low context culture favor written. And it also refers to societies and groups that have close connections over many things, and conversations are understood because of the years of interaction and cultural context. Even small words or gestures carry big meanings and are understood by a majority. And once again, talking about the high context, in high context, a message cannot be understood without a great deal of background information. Like countries like Asian, African, Arab, Central European, Latin American, generally considered to be high context culture, and a message cannot be understood until and unless you have a great deal of background information. For example, if they're making a joke, you cannot understand a joke because there's a certain context to it, there's a certain political history, there's a certain political, historical, religious background if they're discussing something. So, yes, since people are a lot more connected in a high context culture, so all this changes a lot. So, once again, what is, you can look at the picture, the high context culture, are you aware of the big difference? And the person, if he's responding in the low context culture, there's always going to be communication barriers, there's always going to be communication problems. So now today's topic is low context culture. So we have to look at it, how it goes, and we'll start off with associations. What kind of associations are there in low context culture? So let's start from association. And the relationships in low context culture are pretty much different from the high context culture, and relationships begin and end quickly in the low context culture. Many people can be inside one circle, circle's boundaries not clear, and there's a lot of focus on individualism, and things get done by following procedures and paying attention to the goal. It's a pretty much goal oriented association, and the one's identity is rooted in oneself and one's accomplishment. Like it clearly explains the individualism, the individualistic society, individual achievements. That's what we've commonly seen, mainly in the Western world, how that's portrayed, because achievements are individual as well. Even there are group achievements as well, but yes, an individual is given a lot of importance because that's how. But in high context culture, it's mainly the groups that are involved, mainly the culture, the society that's involved. But in the West, they give a lot of preference to the individual, and the social structure is pretty much decentralized as well. It's not just like, decentralized. They're given a lot of autonomy. Individuals can do a lot. There's a power at the top, but they've given the power and the authority to the individuals as well in certain sectors. So that's pretty much different from ours, where we clearly rely on in the high context culture, where we rely mainly on the interaction, where there is elderly system, there's a system, there's a society, there's a culture that bounds you to certain specific groups or certain elderly group, or even in the family structures it's different. But yes, in the Western societies the social structure is decentralized, and there's nothing good or bad about being centralized or decentralized, but this is how the system is. That there's a lot of autonomy. Individuals can pursue their goals. They can move out uh, after turning 18. That's what we mainly see in the Western societies. But let me once again remind that it's not exactly how it happens. It may be different over there as well. The people may have some different connections, or they may have different roots, or they may have different upbringing. We are just generally talking about low context culture, and that low context culture, the social structure is decentralized. That talk about interaction, that the interactions are this is a low use of non-verbal elements. Messages carried out more by words than by non-verbal means, and the verbal message is explicit. Context is less important than words, because words are the most important thing, because they rely mainly on words. On the written context, it needs to be stated explicitly. This is what their interaction is based on. And the verbal message is direct. One spells things out exactly as it is, because there's no room for anything else. And they focus mainly on the direct communication, as we've spoken earlier as well, that one spells things out exactly as well. The conditions, everything is stated explicitly. And communication is seen as a way of exchanging information, ideas, and opinions. And similarly, disagreement is depersonalized. One withdraws from conflict with another and gets on with the task. And focus is on rational solutions, not personal ones. And one can be explicit about another's bothersome behavior as well. So Disagreement is depersonalized. It's not taken as offensive. The meetings can go on serious. They can seriously disagree with themselves, but that's not taken offensive, and it's not taken as an attack on another's pride. It's not taken an attack on another's tribe. This is what the low context communication does. That after the meeting's done, it's done professionally and focuses on rational solutions, not personal ones. So the personal element is not there when it comes to such disagreements. And when we talk about territoriality, space is compartmentalized and privately owned, and privacy is the most important thing. So people are further apart because we can see that a lot of space is given to privacy. That's the most important part. Space is compartmentalized. The individual, that's the typical how you can see the typical life of an individual. You'll guess that by having some private space, private property, private living space. After the 9 to 5 work, people want to be in their own confined spaces rather than in huge crowds and huge families and all that. So that's typical of countries with low context, that space is compartmentalized and privately owned. And then we talk about temporality, that the things are scheduled to be done at particular time, one thing at a time, and that activity, the important thing is that activity should be done efficiently. And this is what we've seen in some of the countries. You can give one example of Germany. It's often said that if a professor gives you a specific time and if you're late, that's considered an insult. So some countries take time quite seriously, and the things are scheduled. If you are late on the schedule, if you're delaying things, that's considered offensive, and that's pretty much different from the countries of high context, where time is a concept, but people often go late to the weddings, and it's considered normal. People often go to an hour late to a place where they're scheduled, but that makes hardly a difference in context. Countries with high context, but if you are living in a country with low context, time matters a lot. Everything is scheduled, and that's the important point. So Japan is one of those high context countries, which is a rare example, where timing is very much valued. Time is a lot valued. It's very important, and that's why it's very important to go on about it. And another thing is that change is fast. One can make change and see immediate results. Things can be rescheduled. For example, you can see that the low context countries, they mostly rely on email, they're texting, they're changing venues, and they let you know quickly. And that's what the change is faster. They know the adaptability is faster. So this is what happens a lot in low context culture. And time is a commodity to be spent or saved, and one's time is one's own. It's a very important thing. Time is money. They value a lot of time. They value their time, and that's the important thing when you're living in low context culture. You need to know particularly to be on time. That's the most important thing one needs to be aware of, because time is money. It's about the value. It's like a commodity. It should be either spent or saved, and there's nothing else. There's nothing else beyond that. And then we have the learning, and the learning is different in low context cultures as well. Thinking is inductive. It proceeds from specific to general and focuses on detail, and this is how it goes from specific to general. The focus on tiny details as well, and learning occurs by following explicit directions. Everything is stated clearly, everything is explained, and that's how it works. The learning, that's how it happens in the low context cultures, that everything is clearly defined. And then an individual orientation is preferred for learning and problem solving, and that's another element of low context culture. And similarly, speed is valued, and how efficiently something is learned is important. So these are some of the points that we talk about learning, that thinking is inductive, learning occurs by explicit directions, and individual orientation is preferred and speed is valued. And this is how learning takes place, and that's why Western academia or the countries with low context culture, their learning pattern is pretty much different from those of the high context culture. So we can see the countries where it starts from Japan and China, and then it's Arab countries and Greek. They're on top of high context cultures, and towards the low context, you can see Scandinavian, German, Swiss. These are some of the good examples of low context cultures that you can see. So we are now reaching towards the end of our session. So what did we learn? We learned that culture varies from place to place, and low context is more direct and explicit and communication depends on the high context and low context of any given society, culture, or space we are living in. That's an important point. The places you change, whenever you go, you need to see what kind of cultural context is there. That's how you behave, that's how you interact, and that's how you adapt to the situation. And our interactions, our associations, and even communication depends on which culture we are living in or belonging to, because that's an important point. The more we interact, the more we have associations, the better understanding we are going to have about the culture we are living in. So initially, it's not easy for anyone to understand that the culture they're going to is a high context or low context culture. But the more you read about it, the more you interact with people, the more you learn from your colleagues and peers, you are going to understand that it's different. And yes, one particular thing that is important about low context culture is the value of time. People from our regions, when they go abroad, they might think that going 5 minutes or 10 minutes late will not make a difference, but it does. It's considered offensive. It's not liked by the professors or the people or the individuals. So it's important to understand as a student, if you're going abroad for higher studies, that time is money. If a professor is asking you to meet at 9 o'clock, you need to be at a sharp 9. That's what makes a difference. That's what makes an impact, because they're direct, they're more specific, and more the rules are clearly defined, and it's different from our high context culture. So interestingly, I hope you enjoyed the session today. But before ending our session, there are some questions that, if you can think about it, that what do you think of low context culture? Which cultures come into your mind? How do you perceive it? And how do you see Pakistani culture in this context? Are you influenced by the high context or low context culture? What do you like about the low context culture? Do you like them being about specific about time? Do you like the individualism? Do you like the privacy? Or do you like communal spaces where people are together? What do you think about that? An important question in terms of economics is that, has capitalism or any other economic system affected the way we live in? Do you think economics also shape our low context and high context, or the cultures that we're living in? But these are some of the important points that you can think about, write about, and it will give you a broader perspective of looking into things. So these are some of the references that we have used, and I hope that you really enjoyed the session. We've discussed in detail both the high context, and today we discussed the low context culture. Thank you for being here. I will be talking more about it in our next session. Thank you very much.